So tell me, are the hours of service laws truly needed, or have they become a hindrance on the trucking industry?
The white lines hum a familiar tune today. Nemo's got the shotgun, head against the glass. It wasn't steel or the diesel's black heart that laid the foundation and gave us our start. Oh, it's the code, it's the grit, it's the shared story told. It's a bond forged in heat, never bought, never sold. With Nemo by my side through the thick and
Fully understand the debate here, we must first look back into history. Hours of service regulations were originally born out of a critical need to combat driver fatigue and improve highway safety during the early days of the interstate commerce historically. These rules were established a hard line in the sand, dictating exactly how long a driver could work and when they had to rest, thus setting a federal standard aimed at preventing exhaustion-related tragedies on the highway. In 1937, the ICC, or Interstate Commerce Commission, originally put out the original hours of service rules. Those rules were made in conjunction with supporting organizations such as the Teamsters. Now, some of you are probably asking what the Teamsters were doing in the trucking industry back then. And it's actually interesting. From 1937 to around 1980s, the trucking industry was heavily regulated. And then in 1980s became the Deregulation Act. So majority of your drivers from 1930s to the 1980s, majority of them were union. So where does this come into effect? Well, the union set out to represent drivers with the FCC, or sorry, the ICC, in order to protect drivers from aggressive and predatory behaviors by carriers. For example, the freight being more important than the driver's well-being. Carriers back then were known for pushing their drivers to drive unreasonable hours, not getting enough rest, and thus it created a massive safety and well-being issue for truck drivers, as well as the motoring public back then. So since the conception, since the introduction of the original hours of service laws, there have been a couple of revisions brought on throughout history. The 1960s was a big event. The 1990s, early 2000s, 2013, all the way up until the pilot program in 2006, that is currently being conducted by the FMCSA. So the argument now comes into effect. Are hours of service laws actually needed in the year 2026? So I did a little bit of digging in, and I wanted to address this argument from both the pro, the con, and I even threw a monkey wrench into the conversation. So we'll start off with the arguments supporting the hours of service. Let's see. Those who And to clarify, I actually wrote my notes down in my computer because this is a lot of ground to cover, and I'm not good at going verbatim. And usually when I just wing it, it doesn't come out right. So my teleprompter tells me to say, those who support keeping these regulations argue they are just as vital today as they are in the past. First, these regulations aren't just about limiting hours. They're a vital shield for newer drivers. Mega carriers often rely on commercially licensed rookies who may not yet have developed a keen sense, the keen senses needed to recognize the subtle signs of dangerous fatigue before it's too late. Second, beyond just guarding the newer drivers, these laws act as essential armor for all company drivers, providing a clear, federally mandated shield against aggressive tactics from carriers that might prioritize profit over the well-being, effectively pushing them to drive drivers beyond safe limits. Third, these regulations create a more predictable, level playing field for the entire industry. Without them, carriers can cut corners and push drivers to exhaustion, could gain an unfair economic advantage, undercutting the safer fleets that prioritize compliance and safety, and ensuring that safety isn't sacrificed for profit. Finally, these regulations aren't just for the drivers, they are a critical layer of protection for the general public. By ensuring that the commercial vehicles are operated by rested professionals, these laws significantly reduce the risk of catastrophic accidents, with passenger cars making the highways safer for everyone on the road. So in other words, the hours of service laws are needed because the most vulnerable drivers when it comes to hours of service compliance, and this argument would be W-2 drivers or drivers who work for carriers. Without these laws drawing a hard line in the sand saying what a driver can do, a carrier is more likely to push the driver to his limits or beyond his limits, which can cause an unsafe situation for both the driver and the motoring public. Secondly, hours of service laws are important for rookie drivers. I remember the first few years I was in the truck, and it's hard to figure out your limits when you're a new driver. How far can I drive? When is tired too tired? What am I capable of doing? So, in a sense, the hours of service laws are very important in that aspect because it gives a framework for a rookie driver to work in and to gain experience, to gain the ability to learn their own limitations. And this all ties together with the overall function and the overall purpose and the need for hours of service laws, which is safety. And safety is number one. And fatigue drivers are a major cause of accidents on today's highways. Now, obviously, there's a lot of drivers out there who are going to raise plenty of counter arguments, me included. So we can't argue the need for hours of service laws without addressing why we don't need them or the counter argument. So, however, the counter arguments are equally compelling. First of all, the hours of service laws create a Oh, sorry, I gotta reread my notes here. The hours of service laws create I can't even speak English. Hence the reason why ELP is important. Logistical rigidities, where delays in traffic or whether leave drivers unable to find safe parking before their clocks run out. The second one, these rules ignore the driver's own practical judgment, forcing them to drive when they feel, forcing them to drive when they feel alert or stop when they feel that they could drive more. In other words, a lot of drivers talk about this. The clock forces them to drive when they're tired and the rest when they're not. Why? Because that is the way the hours of service laws are enforced. Third, they create a significant financial and operational challenges for the owner-operators, severely limiting their ability to manage their own time and business. And finally, a one-size-fits-all nature of the regulation ignores regional differences in diverse operating conditions, making it difficult for drivers in varying environments to adapt efficiently. So, for example, let's use the example, you are an East Coast driver, your circadian rhythm is set to an Eastern Standard Time, your hours of service clocks are set to an Eastern Standard Time, but yet you're on the Pacific Coast, which is a 3-hour difference. Your body and your clock are not going to be synced with the time zone that you're in. Also, it comes down to relying on a government to tell you when you are tired. What other industry in America is there where the government tells you what your bedtime is? And furthermore, the hours of service laws also cause their own logistical challenges because shippers, carriers, and brokers, they often create tight appointment windows. And any delays at, say, point A, point B, or anywhere in between, not only does that put stress on your ability to make your appointment window, but that chews into your clock. So let's say you have enough time on your clock to get from point A to point B. Well, guess what? There's an accident in between. Not your fault. You're not even involved. You're just stuck in traffic. What happens? Your clock runs out. You're forced to park for 10 consecutive hours. You miss your appointment window. You get banged at the broker, even though it was no fault of your own. So, in a lot of ways, the hours of service rules create more problems than they solve for an owner-operator. Now, we can't talk about hours of service without bringing in the next and newest arguments to the hours of service. What am I talking about? The safety paradox caused by autonomous trucking. Looking ahead, the logistical landscape is being reshaped by technology from companies like Aurora, which claim their driverless trucks can operate at a significant 87 cents per mile cost advantage over traditional drivers. Because they bypass human-centric hours of service rules, they introduce an unprecedented competitive advantage and can operate continuously. However, as legislation and public debate pushes for trained observers to be physically present in these vehicles, they're not yet required. The argument follows that these systems should be bound to the same fatigue limits, effectively leveling the playing field and ensuring the human element is never compromised for the sake of continuous productivity. Furthermore, if the primary purpose of having an observer, all right, this went completely, I didn't want to get to that point yet, but we'll continue this. So in other words, what Aurora is claiming is their trucks are on average 85% or 85 cents per mile cheaper than a traditional driver truck because they can operate continuously without being bound by hours of service laws. Now, obviously, that creates an unfair competitive advantage. For example, Hirschbach recently announced that they're partnering with Aurora for their I-10 corridor from, I believe it was from Houston to Phoenix. Now, that is a 1,000 mile run. Traditionally, one driver compliant with hours of service operations could probably do 3 legs in 1 week. That's 1 trip there, 1 trip back, and then 1 trip there. An Aurora driverless truck can just keep going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, turn and burn. So they could essentially do maybe 8, 9 of those legs in a week. How is that fair to traditional truck drivers? How do we compete with that? And then it also raises, as I said in my paragraph, it raises a lot of questions about who is monitoring these trucks. So there are a few states out there who are debating legislation that mandates that an observer be inside of a driverless truck while it is in operation. So that raises the argument, if a observer is in that truck, observing the equipment while it is moving, will that observer be bound by hours of service laws? Will that observer need to take a half-hour break? Will that observer need to take a consecutive 10-hour off-duty status? And if so, what happens to the truck? Does it keep rolling while the observer is in the sleeper berth? That again, if that is the case, then that raises the question, well, what is the observer even doing in the truck to begin with? Think about that. The purpose of an observer being in the truck is to monitor the truck's operation for safety. How can an observer monitor a moving truck if they are in the sleeper berth? Has anybody brought this up in the conversation with legislation over these observer debates? If an observer is mandated to be in the truck while it's in operation, will the truck be bound to the observer's hours of service clock? So ultimately, whether hours of service laws are truly needed or are a hindrance remains the most critical and unresolved question in the trucking industry. As technology and logistics evolve, the debate forces us to weigh the value of human-centric regulations against the relentless push for maximum efficiency. So let me know down below in the comments. Do you still think hours of service laws are needed? Are they a hindrance to company drivers? Are they a hindrance to owner-operators? How is driverless trucks going to affect this conversation? Give that some long, hard thought. And thank you for watching.